Namaste. So I want to talk about people after a loved one dies. But I want to talk first about greed, hatred, and delusion, which are the three poisons in Buddhism. They're sometimes softened to be clinging, aversion, and I forget what delusion becomes. But I really like it, not surprisingly probably, stuck. Greed, hatred, delusion. And one of those, according to Buddhist thought, predominates everybody's personality. We're either a greed, a hatred, or a delusion. So, this is going to sound like a joke, but a greed, a hatred, and a delusion go to a party. And they walk into the room at the house where the party is. The greed looks around and says, I really like that vase in the corner. I'd like to have a vase just like that. In fact, I wonder if I can sneak out of here with that vase because that would look really nice in my house. The hatred walks in and says, those are the ugliest drapes I've ever seen in my life. Who in the hell would spend money hanging those ugly curtains in their home? And the delusion says, look, a unicorn. Yes. I think you are. And of course that's a little extreme, but you could say it a little more gently by saying that a greed walks into a room and spots something they like. A hatred walks into the room and spots something they don't like. And a delusion walks into the room and seems to see something that nobody else in the room can see.
I thought it was called a mystic.
Well, no, because it's a different sort of... Hopefully a mystic sees what's really there. And a delusion does not necessarily see what's really there.
So
What's the unicorn? I don't know, I don't see it. So now, so hold that in mind. And then that first reading tells us that people basically become greedy jerks after a loved one dies because they're responding from a different part of their brain. And we've all probably seen this more often than not. It's like, and an example particularly close to Aaron and I, you can see people who have virtually no involvement with somebody in their family until they die. And then they die and they want the stuff. I'm going to get the stuff. And I suspect they're going to get the stuff because in cases like that where there's estrangement, they're feeling rather guilty about the fact that there was estrangement. But if I can get enough stuff, I can convince myself, see, we were really close after. There's also the rare occasion, and I actually saw this with Aaron's family, where somebody passes, and everybody, grandma passed, and everybody was most generous about what happened to the stuff. There was no acrimony. There was fairness. Holy cow. And then, more recently, I saw another one of those of the first type where the brother was going to sue because he was sure that he wasn't getting what he ought to get out of the estate fast enough. So now, accepting for a moment that this is us reacting from a different part of our brain, that doesn't mean we can't change it. If it's true that when we're really distressed, our brains work different, the goal would be then to do away or reduce that distress. And there's two other sub-thoughts. The first is that if you absolutely know what you want to have happen with your stuff, write it down before you go. The second thing is that we need to start talking about death. Now, that's a very culturally conditioned thing. I heard a story from someone this week about the truth that in South Africa, they don't talk about death. In fact, if the doctor would walk into the patient's room in South Africa and say, "I'm sorry, you have 6 months to live," that would be considered very rude, very abrupt, and very unprofessional. So when grandma dies, it's entirely possible that at least some of the people have no idea it's coming. But they make it better by leaving the body in the home for 30 days. Opening the doors and windows relatively quickly to kind of air the place out. I suppose it's a way to get grandma to stay with you. But I mention it because it points out that this is very culturally conditioned. And so if it's culturally conditioned, it doesn't mean that it's an innate part of who we are as human beings, and that means we can change it. And we change it by looking at our reaction. Because I want to say, when somebody dies, the people that cause the blow up in the family, they're the grievings. Right? They're diverting to that part of the personality and saying, I got to get some stuff to remember Fred by, or whatever. The hatreds are like scarce. You know, they might be in the back row at the funeral, but they really don't come around. And the delusions are probably in denial about the fact that the person died, or denial about how they're feeling about it, how it's impacting them, and they're going to have their crisis 9 months from now. But if we can slow down, we can watch our reactions. If we can learn to check in with ourselves, I believe we're less likely to get shifted off base to this place where now we're reacting from those core tendencies. You know, greed, hatred, and delusion might be described as our knee-jerk reaction. And if we're self-reflective, and if we just examine what's going on and how we're feeling and where in our body we're feeling it, when we start to fall into one of these patterns, we have a much better chance of catching ourselves. So you won't, as I saw once, go to an posthumous award for the dearly departed at a gathering of the departed's colleagues and say something like, you know, if X were here, the one thing they would want you to know is how important it is for you to give your life to Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. When in fact, that would have been the last thing that X would have ever said to anybody, and she probably would have said, the most important thing is that you're kind and compassionate to us. So how do we slow down? How do we avoid getting to the place where should Jesus stumble into the room, which would surely be a mistake, but should he stumble into this room, the thing we would not run up to him and say, I mean, if you think about it, however you view Jesus, when he was alive, was regarded as a spiritual teacher. And this guy charges up to him with an extremely selfish question. Tell my brother to give me my stuff. How do we get there? I think we get there by first of all realizing that everybody dies. And then from that flows the second realization, which is if we want that person or a piece of that person or the memory of that person to remain with us, we need to start now, before they die, building those memories. Because if we have those memories, we're not going to need objects to convince us that we were close to them. That's non-attachment. And the third thing is, as that death draws close, we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it with each other. We need to talk about it with the person that's about to die. They need to talk about it with us. We need to get as much of the heavy emotional lifting as we can, done before we're confronted with the emotional turmoil and the death happening. And our Western tendency to push it off isn't going to help. I'm not sure, because it's such a cultural difference, but I'm pretty convinced that with a possible with some exception, Asian cultures do not run around picking over the deceased's possessions quite as vigorously as we do. And it's because there's this different perspective. It's because even if you can get, even if you had a grandma who lived through the Depression, and so everything in her house has been covered with plastic since since plastic covers came out, and plastic runners over the carpet, My grandmother had a plastic runner over the shag carpet, and every time I looked at it, I was reminded that the grass needed to be cut, But, so, what's that couch, even if it's been hermetically sealed in plastic, going to do for you? Nothing. What's that shag carpeting? If you could pull it up and put it in your house, you have to ask yourself why you would do that, but if you could, what's it going to do for you? Nothing. And so the shift is to talk about death is a reality, death is a part of life. And if you're, a worst case scenario, you're confronted with somebody who's really raking you over the coals and wants all the grandma's stuff, I think what you should say is, don't worry. I've been robbing grandma blind for years. All the good stuff is gone already. Amen.